Okay. It looks like we are live. How is everyone today? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jason Levine, and for today's live stream, I brought in my colleague Karl Soule once again. This is now our regular Thursday collaboration stream, and he's going to talk to you about some editing tips and tricks for migrating from Avid Media Composer to Premiere Pro, and really specifically talking about this source record workflow, which anyone coming from the Avid world will be really familiar with. So please join me in welcoming my dear esteemed colleague, Karl Soule, live from the Adobe Studios in Santa Monica, California. How's it going today, Karl?
Well, good morning, Jason, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody around the world. Thanks again for having me, Jason.
Awesome. No, dude, it's so great. And we had such an amazing response last week that really, I'm so glad we're doing this as a regular thing. And just to kind of refresh everybody who's watching or tuning in for the first time today across YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, and Behance, my colleague Karl works in the video side of our Adobe business based out of Santa Monica. And he works specifically with top Hollywood editors. A lot of the major films that Premiere has been used on, Karl has been there in the trenches, and he does a lot with episodic TV and everything else, and he knows these super high-end workflows, and he can really give you a very unique and direct perspective on not only that part of the industry, but again, if you're sort of integrating and working with other wares, other software, other NLEs, and how those kind of fit into the Premiere Pro and Creative Cloud universe. So, without further ado, and it's worth mentioning that I will, of course, be monitoring all the various chats, so I can feed Karl your questions. So as he's showing things, if there's something specific that you want to see or have a question about, I can feed those to Karl. Additionally, we'll also be answering some questions at the end, and we're targeting about 45 minutes for this session today. So I think, Karl, we're ready if you are. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to switch over to you. We'll go solo on you for a minute here and take it away.
All right, thanks, Jason. The background that I've had for the last few years, I've actually gotten my name in the post-production section of the credits in a number of films. It's like really small, and it's like right before it says no animals were harmed during the making of this movie. But it's one of the honors of being down here as part of this team is to see my name in the credits for movies like Terminator: Dark Fate, Only the Brave, a number of different documentaries, some special credits in Netflix comedy specials and things like that. So it really runs the gamut of TV, streaming services like Amazon and Netflix, and of course feature films. What I'm going to focus on today, what I wanted to focus on is, in a weird way, it's kind of an older style of editing. A lot of modern people are just kind of used to dropping stuff direct to the timeline and trimming stuff down. And you can always work however you want to work. And one of the things I've always loved about Premiere Pro is it is one of the most flexible NLEs on the market, meaning you can kind of pick your workflow and work the way you want to work. What I wanted to focus on today are some tips and tricks if you're trying to get the most out of what we call source record editing. And what I mean by this is, obviously, when you're looking at Premiere Pro, we have the two main monitors that you typically work with. You have your source monitor, which is where you load clips and you kind of preview clips and you pick the good bits. And then you have your record monitor, or program monitor is what we technically call it in Premiere. And the program monitor is used for playback of the timeline and picking that moment in time where you want to drop things in. And when we're talking about this idea of source record editing, the big benefits of this, first off, it lets you be very, very precise and commit to where you want to put stuff. You never drop stuff in a timeline unless you know that you're going to use that clip. So if you've ever just kind of grabbed a bunch of clips and thrown them in a timeline and started splicing and cutting away, this is a problem that happens to me sometimes. I go to export and I forget that I have like one little tiny segment of a clip way off in the end of the timeline, and I have to go back and kind of clean some of that up, clean up the extra bits that I didn't mean to put in there. So source record is very, very precise. The other benefit for it is it kind of gives you a way of seeing what you're putting in a place before you commit to it. And the last thing is it's also very fast. Everything that you do with this can be set up to be driven by the keyboard. And there are a number of keyboard shortcuts that I wanted to talk to people about. what I'm going to really focus on as part of this is kind of the things that I teach for somebody who's moving over from Media Composer, which is all based around source record editing. They're moving into Premiere Pro, and they want to get comfortable, and they want to continue to edit in the style that they're used to, because these high-end craft editors, they're hired because they have a unique way of telling a story, and we don't want the tools to get in the way of that. So the cool thing is Premiere is super flexible for being able to do that. It just takes, like, in the first couple days of using it, you kind of go in and you customize things and you get things set up the way you want, so then you can work faster and work better. So if you're coming from Media Composer, or if you want to learn this style of editing in the future, I think both groups are going to benefit from today's session. But some of the first things I'm going to show you here are actual keyboard shortcuts and things that you want to get set up ahead of time, because it's really going to help do the types of things that you're used to if you're coming over from Media Composer. So with that, the first thing that I want to jump in is a really, really small one, but it's one of these things that it really bugs people the first time they see it, and they ask me all kinds of questions about it, and I tell them that there's a 2-minute fix for it, and you'll never have to worry about it again. If I bring up my screen right now, let me zoom into the track headers here. I have taken the time on this timeline to name all my tracks, but we're not seeing the names when I'm zoomed all the way in. If I hold the Shift key and scroll my mouse, you can see here are the names of the different tracks. They do actually show up here, but they're buried when I'm zoomed all the way out. Editors typically want to be able to see the track names all the time, and there was this false belief for a while that, oh, well, Premiere can't do that. It's really just a matter of customizing this track area space. So what I always recommend, some of the functions like sync lock, doing voiceover recording for a craft editor, those are unnecessary features. And by right-clicking on the track header, we can choose to customize the track header. Let me do that a little bit up a little further on the screen here so that we can see that on the feed. I'll do a right-click up here, right there. There we go. So I'll click on Customize. And when I do that, I'm presented with this button editor. Now, here's where it gets, it's not tricky per se, but a lot of people don't realize that to remove a button, you can literally just grab it and drag it off, or you can grab it from here and drag it down to move it to a different location. So if I want to move the voiceover record to that second tier, and again, what I just did here is I moved the name to the first tier of items in the track header, I can ensure that the names of the tracks are going to show up all the time. I do the same thing with the toggle sync lock. Sync lock is something I'll talk about maybe in a little bit. It can be a useful thing, but it's also it is one of those cases of with great power comes great responsibility. So I like to hide it away so that I have to be zoomed into a track before I'm going to toggle that function. So once I've gone in and customized this, click OK. Now, even when I'm zoomed in, where I've got all the audio tracks minimized, I'm still seeing the names of the tracks. And this is definitely the way a lot of editors prefer to work. They want to be able to see all the tracks at a single time. If you ever look at like Timeline Tuesday on places like Twitter, and you see some of the screenshots from other NLEs, the naming tracks is a big way to stay organized. And this just ensures that you're always going to see that. It also removes some of the clutter on the interface so that you're not seeing that microphone. There's no chance you're going to accidentally click on the microphone. You can do the same thing for the video tracks as well. There's fewer options on the video track layers, but again, here we have the customization functionality. Again, I'm going to take the video track and drop it to the top here. I'm going to take the sync lock function and drop that down a layer. So again, that's a little bit more hidden, and I don't have to deal with it. Go ahead and click OK. And now you can see, the names of the video tracks even have meaning here. We're putting AE titles up at the top. We're putting the video clips on V1, and then we've got this matte layer in between. So just one of those little shortcuts that I like to make sure people are aware of. Now, another thing that is used a lot, because oftentimes we're taking a clip and we want to see if there's additional room on a shot. So if I scroll to a particular shot here in my timeline, maybe we'll zoom in a little bit so I can see this. I need to see if I can extend or maybe get a different camera move with this particular piece of footage. So the match frame key shortcut is used a lot in source record editing. By default, we map it to the F key. So by tapping F, it loads this clip in the source monitor here, where now I can actually see if I've got any more headroom or tail room to work with. Now, the key thing to note when I'm doing this, it automatically, whenever I hit match frame, it loads the current frame that I'm looking at into the source monitor. And I've got my machine set up so it's actually marking that as a new in point. That's an important thing. So if I've decided that I want to cut this in elsewhere, or I want to, extend the end of this out, or I need to move it to a different layer, or anything that I want to do, by default in Premiere, when I match frame, it doesn't give me a new in point marker by default. That's a Media Composer function. Everybody coming from Media Composer will know what I'm talking about here. And a lot of people don't know we added a preference about 2 years ago. And that preference is found under the timeline menu. Let me zoom in again here so we can see this. Timeline, and it's this bottom checkbox here, match frame sets in point. Make sure you can see this on screen there. There we go. So by having match frame sets in point checked, this just ensures if I'm going to be using that match frame function quite a bit, that I'm always going to get, it saves me that extra keystroke. And particularly if you're doing source record editing, you end up doing this, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times throughout the day. Clicking that one extra keystroke may not seem like a lot, but when you're doing it that many times, it's a really, really big deal. Now let me show you exactly what I mean by source record editing, because this gets into this area on the timeline here with these source patches, or what these are called. Now, you'll note there's two sets of blue buttons here. I'm not going to be turning on or playing with or changing this right-hand row of buttons here, because this has more to do with how certain menu commands work, where if I'm copying something, or I'm running a process within an in and out range, Premiere is set up in such a way that if I'm doing something to the timeline, like I've marked an in and out range, and I want to hit the delete key, or I want to do something where I'm extracting this information, lifting it out of the timeline, leaving a gap, something along those lines, we use these target buttons for doing that. But these have no impact on what's going on when I'm cutting in from the source monitor. What I mean by cutting in from the source monitor, I'm going to go ahead and do just a quick example of this. Most people, this is really, really basic stuff, but I'm just going to give you an example of how this works. Nothing selected in my timeline. I'm going to cut in this shot of the young boy, and I'm going to put my playhead in the timeline, like right here. Let me go to a different spot in the timeline here. Like right here, I just want to randomly cut it in at this point. I mark an in point, I mark an out point. Now I use the track targeting buttons to determine what am I cutting in. Do I need the audio from the clip? Maybe not. So in this case, I'm going to turn off the audio. Where do I want the video cut in? Do I want to overcut what I already have in V1, or do I want to stick this up on V3? I pick this little item up, or again, there's a keyboard shortcut for moving this up and down. There's also a right-click menu where you can see things like move all sources up, move all sources down. And from here, now I know that I'm going to cut this clip from the source monitor is going to be cut into V3 in my timeline. So once I do this, I then have a couple of options here for whether I want to insert or overwrite this. Well, if I use overwrite right now, it's just going to plop it right in the timeline. There's nothing in V3 right now. So let's go ahead and click overwrite. 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 What am I doing wrong? Do I have a locked track? Oh, I may have locked the track. Let me move this down one.
I was going to say, maybe check for locked tracks. Couldn't get unmuted fast enough.
Wow. All right. What am I doing wrong here? This should be working. This is pretty basic stuff. I'll make sure I've got that selected. Is it too short? Let me try a different clip here. We'll take this clip. I'll match frame this up into my source. Ooh, what's going on here? What about this clip? I'm just going to move to a different timeline here just to check to see what's going on. Something, oh, how interesting. All right, bear with me 1 second. I got something kind of interesting going on here. Let me go back to a section of this timeline. It looks like I'm doing something. This may be because of something I'm doing some testing of in the background here for something called productions that we've announced a couple weeks ago. Looks like I'm somehow cutting in from one timeline in one project into a completely different timeline. And this may just be a matter of what I'm dealing with on some of the data. Let me just test this out really quick. This is all working earlier today. So that works. Now let's say I want to cut in another shot from this same edited sequence over here, and let me use the overwrite key. Okay, it's cutting it in there. That's what I wanted to see. Let me move it up to V5 so everybody can see what's going on here. Ah, okay. So sorry about that. I got some wonkiness in an older project file, and it's causing some issues. Let me go ahead and just start that over again so that you can see what's going on here. The joys of testing multiple versions of the application all at once.
Oh yeah,
okay.
I feel your pain.
So I've got this segment, this nice quote from the interview here. I want to be able to drop this into a different spot on my timeline here. Maybe I want to replace this wide shot, for example. So what I can do is very precisely position my playhead where I want using keyboard shortcuts. So we'll just go to the beginning of this, right about there. And I've got my quote is already marked in my in and out point. Now I can pick and choose exactly what track I want to cut this in. There's no dragging and dropping and trimming. There's no moving stuff around. It's a very precise function. I can say, you know what, let's just let's put this over the top. I'm going to drop it into the video 5 track. So again, using track targeting, I can pick and choose where I want to do that. If this is just coverage, I can get rid of the audio by turning the audio layers off. And in one easy step, I can hit the overwrite key, or again, that's the period key on the keyboard. Boom. And if I look down here, it's now cut in a new piece of footage over the top. So again, the reason for doing this on a regular basis is it's all about precision and it's all about speed of use. If you're using your keyboard, if you're dialing everything in the keyboard, you can very quickly get into a routine of using the in and out keys, the overwrite key to drop stuff in precisely where you want it. You can also set up track targeting so that you can move those tracks up and down with a simple series of keyboard strokes. Where people kind of get confused in Premiere is the fact that we have these 2 separate rows of keys, and for some reason they think that these keys will have some kind of an impact on an overwrite edit. They don't. It's all about what is going on over on this side. There can be certain exceptions if we're trying to do certain types of insert edits, but for the most part, You really just have to focus on these keys over on the left-hand side. Let me quickly look at my notes here, just to be sure I'm covering everything that I wanted to cover on this. Are there any questions out there on this so far, Jason?
No, I'm kind of fielding them as we go. You did just have a couple of requests to talk more about. If you want to switch over to your camera for a sec too, I can throw us both up on the screen. Did have just a couple people now on Twitter asking about if you can talk a little bit more about productions. I know we can't really show all that much, but yeah. But everything else, everybody's kind of, I think, in awe, and you had a lot of applause and appreciation for showing how to customize track headers. That's one of those, I know when I show it, that's one of those things that tends to elude a lot of people, just dragging and dropping the buttons on or off. It's such a nice feature to have that.
Yeah, we are definitely planning on doing a session probably closer to the end of the month, maybe earlier, maybe sometime in early March, where we're going to dive into a whole big section on productions. We are kind of holding off on that a little bit. We've sneaked it, and because it's a sneak peek at productions, it's not something that's shipping yet. They've asked me not go into a deep dive just yet.
Right.
So as soon as I have clearance and authority to do that, I'll be on Jason's channel. We'll definitely dive really deep into productions. If you haven't seen it yet, if you do a search on Adobe Premiere Pro Productions, there's a great video that talks about how productions are kind of a level up from a project, and it enables much better organization if you're doing long form film work, if you're doing collaboration where you've got a group of editors that want to work together on a shared storage system. And it's something we've been working on a lot on our team. We're super excited to be able to talk about it. A lot of the underpinnings and the technology that are in productions were actually used during the making of movies like Dolomite Is My Name on Netflix, on Terminator Dark Fate. And it's also one of the biggest things for those out there that have worked in kind of a collaborative environment using what we call shared projects. It is something that eliminates any possibility where you could get duplicate master clips. So that's one of the key things. It really allows you to organize the way you want. And for those who have dealt with that, that's all I can really talk about with productions today. But like I said, I'm super excited when we get told it's okay to talk about it. I'm going to jump in and do a full segment on productions in the near future.
Nice.
While we're talking about track headers, there's one other key thing that I wanted to kind of showcase here, and that is working with these track headers. The height of each of the different tracks is something that I always get a lot of questions on. First off, when you roll your mouse over these tracks, you can expand on the tracks by dragging. When you see this icon, the kind of up-down arrow with the little lines moving outward, is how you expand on the tracks. You'll notice that I use a bunch of keyboard shortcuts. Like if I hold the Shift key down and I scroll up and down, it's basically expanding all the tracks equally at the same time. That works with the scroll wheel on the mouse as well. So that's definitely something to be aware of. Now, what I find working with Avid editors is the nature of all the tracks. They want to set up some flexibility with having certain tracks open wider at certain times to handle certain tasks. If I'm doing a lot of work with the voiceover, for example, I might want to keep all the other tracks minimized and just have the voiceover tracks expanded. And if I'm doing keyframing of these, I might want to really expand this so that I really have a lot of room to come in and start to use keyframes with the volume. If it's a task that you're going back to on a regular basis, the key thing to do here is to make sure and set up some keyboard shortcut presets for being able to do that. In the timeline, if I scroll up here to the little wrench, or for my folks overseas, the spanner menu, I can go in and actually set up a preset. So there are built-in presets for minimizing tracks, expanding all the tracks, but there's also this sort of mystical thing here called Save Preset. By clicking on that, it's going to take a snapshot of the current layout of track heights that I have, and it's going to make a track height preset. So I'm going to go in here and let's call this one VO expanded. And I'm going to assign this a track height preset. I'll give it a keyboard shortcut called track height preset number 1. Once I do that, I can go to my keyboard shortcuts and simply do a search on track height. And you can see here are a bunch of the track height presets that are available to me. So here, there's nothing currently assigned to this. So I can quickly come in and let's just say I want this to be Command Option Shift V. Trying to find something that isn't already being used. It's not giving me an alert saying that that was already assigned to something else. Perfect, that's what I want. Click OK. And now if I come in here and let me just minimize all the tracks, if I suddenly want to work on voiceover, Command Option Shift V, boom, those tracks are expanded for me. And the editors that I work with, they will typically have this for music, for sound effects. They'll have different track height presets so that the timeline can stay the same size on the screen at a time, and they can just have the tracks that they're working on showing up big and easily able to see the waveforms, easily able to see the keyframes, and can go in and do that final sound design work and do the fine-tune tweaking on the sound mix.
That's awesome. Hey, Karl, you got a couple questions. Video editor bloke from Manchester was asking. He actually started on Avid in the 90s, been using Premiere the last couple of years, and he set his layout and keys to match his Avid muscle memory. But one thing he's not been able to replicate is the trim mode. And I know this has come up in some of my other streams too, and we've talked a bit about this. Is that something you could show or talk to a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple things that I wanted to show just dealing with how trim is set up in the timeline. And it is a big shift because an Avid editor is typically, there is a mode of moving things around on the timeline where you can't accidentally grab the head or the tail of a clip. And then there's the mode that you go into where you're actually trimming, and it's just about trimming. You can't like pick up a clip and move it around when you're in trim mode. There is a mode that kind of more closely mimics Premiere where you kind of have everything at your fingertips. But a lot of hardcore Avid editors actually turn that off. They don't use it. They want to make Premiere kind of work more in this mode. A couple of things to note on that front. If need be, if you're just looking for doing some movement around, there's a couple of different things that you can do to access and work with trim mode. First off, Shift T on Premiere is our trim window. And if you're not familiar with it, if you're not using it, it's definitely worth figuring out. If you have switched over to the Avid keyboard shortcut layout, you probably don't have the trim mode mapped to anything by default. So it's worth diving in and finding that. I'm going to go into my keyboard shortcuts really quick just so I can remember what this is. And I can actually do a Shift plus. You used to be able to just type in Shift T to see what this is. So if I hit Shift on my keyboard here, up here, Shift T, Trim Edit is what it is called, Application Sequence Trim Edit. So again, make sure on your system that you have the keyboard shortcut for something called Trim Edit set up to the key that you want. If that is not mapped to anything, that's probably why you're running into an issue. Once you're in trim mode, things should look pretty similar to what you're used to. There are a couple of differences in how we display things, but you can use a keyboard shortcut. There's another one to actually switch between editing modes. Every edit that you do is actually, all the tools are in the trim monitor, but you can set up a keyboard shortcut to use this as well. I'll just show you this by clicking. If I click in the very center, it gives me a rolling edit. If I click over to the left side, it switches me into a trim edit. You can see that this is now a ripple trim. It's got the yellow bracket associated here. And if I click on the right-hand side and move down, you'll see that now we've got the opposite bracket set up. So I'm now trimming the head of the previous clip. So either with the mouse or with keyboard shortcuts, you can very rapidly switch between these different edit modes. And we give you these visual guides directly in the trim window to be able to tell what's going on. These the key buttons here are by default, they're set to trim 1 frame and trim 5 frames. Now, the important thing to note, if I zoom in on this, you might be able to read that. When I click on the 5 frame button, it doesn't say 5 frames. It says trim forward many. It's customizable. This is something you're going to find in preferences. And a lot of editors prefer to work with, maybe put the trim many to a half a second. So if you're editing in 24 frames per second, that would be 12 frames instead of 5 frames. This is found under preferences, trim. And you'll notice we have something here called the large trim offset. It's set to 5 frames right now. I'm just going to change that to 12 frames. And we'll go ahead and click OK. And now if I go back and look at the buttons in the trim window, we now have 12 frames, plus 12 and minus 12. And again, if I roll over this, you can see there's the keyboard shortcut, Option Shift left arrow, Option Shift right arrow to do this with the keyboard. So I definitely, this will give you, when you're in trim mode, the other thing that this also enables is J, K, and L to do dynamic trimming becomes active. So if I'm trying to roll an edit where I want to actually play it back at speed, use J, K, and L to actually do that. And just as a quick example of that, I've got my edit point selected between these 2 clips. I'm going to hold down my Shift key.
You could do anything.
Let me do that one more time here. We'll do a Shift T, and I'm just going to hit the L key. Looks like I'm doing just a couple of frames here. Let me try a different edit point because I think I'm hitting the limit here. So Shift T to jump into this. There you can see how I'm kind of rocking back and forth to try and find the right look on the bicyclist's face that I want to cut into. And you can see the timeline is actually updating live while I'm working on this edit point. So let me do that one more time. Shift T to go into this mode. I'll make sure I'm in a rolling edit point. There's just not enough time. Looks like there's not enough head and tail on this one to make this work. Let me go over to a different shot here. Always looking for footage where I've got like a ton of additional stuff to work with. So let's see, how about that edit point there? We'll hit a Shift T. I'll make sure I'm in rolling edit. There's a good example. So you can see as I'm hitting J and L, I'm kind of rocking the edit point back and forth. And when I stop, it is actually moving the edit point in the timeline. So I'll kind of zoom in there so you can see this. Again, Shift T to go into that trim mode as a ripple edit. And if I just hit the L key, it's actually making that edit happen. If I hit the J key and move it back, it's moving it with what I'm seeing in the timeline. So hope that's enough to kind of get you started and get you going. We did spend a lot of time working on this mode. You can use this will work with in conjunction with having a number pad is one of the other things if you do a lot with trimming, because the number pad acts as your default if you're selecting multiple edits. Like if you hold down the command key, I'll do this on the timeline here so you can see this. If I hold down the command key and drag across a range of clips, and I want to change the duration of all of these, I can do it in the trim window, but I can also just type in on a number key -15, and it will trim all of those edits 15 frames back. So that's another little thing to note. But I should be able to just click these buttons, and even though I'm just seeing the first edit point that I selected, it's doing them all at the same time. And you can see that as it's happening in the timeline here. Okay.
Super.
I could do a whole section on trims.
Yeah, right.
This is definitely something I like to talk about. But there's another thing that I wanted to showcase here. I wanted to get in and talk a little bit about a unique use of the source monitor that a lot of Avid editors are used to the idea of loading a sequence in the source monitor. And this is one of those things that a lot of people who come from a Premiere or a Final Cut background aren't as aware how useful it can be to have something loaded up in the source monitor. To load a sequence in the source monitor, here I've switched to a slightly different project here, and I've got my timeline is actually started over here. And I've created a series of other timelines which are basically organized by footage. So here I've got some shots from Amsterdam. Here I've got some shots from Iceland that I want to work with. And so as I'm cutting this music video, I want to use these almost like clips. Instead of having to go in and like copy clips from one to the other, I want to use these edits as a source and be able to actually cut them in using the insert and overwrite buttons. There's an old term that's used for this. It's something called a chem roll. KEM is what it stood for, and it had to do with stringing a bunch of clips together on film and sending them over. So if you want to sound old and hipster, you can use the term chem roll for this. But basically, to load a timeline in the source monitor, I can drag and drop it, or I can right click on it and choose open in timeline, or I can set up a keyboard shortcut. And if you do a search on, or I'm sorry, not open in timeline, open in source monitor. I'm a little out of it today. There we go. So this keyboard shortcut, open in source monitor, will enable you to actually like load up a timeline over in the source monitor. So once you have a timeline loaded up, one thing that Media Composer editors miss is being able to see the timeline for the source monitor and be able to toggle back and forth between the timeline in the source monitor and the timeline in the program or record monitor. So a lot of people don't know you can do this in Premiere. It takes a little bit of setup work, but if you click on the wrench menu here, there's an option here that says open sequence in timeline, and that can also be driven by the keyboard. So when I do this, by default, you can now see that as I'm scrubbing my timeline, the record or program monitor isn't playing back. The source monitor is playing back. This is the timeline that's loaded up over here. So if I wanted to make an in and out mark here in this timeline, I could select an in point, select an out point, and I'm now cutting in a whole range of clips into the timeline that I want to actually edit with. So in this case, that would be this timeline here. I'm cutting them into V1. I should be able to hit the overwrite button. And if I zoom back out, you can see, this is an important thing to note. Why is this a solid bar instead of all of those bits and pieces? This is cutting in a nest right now. And this goes back to one of the buttons in Premiere Pro that has the longest name of any button out there. It is called the Insert and Overwrite Sequences as Nests or Individual Clips button. Jason, do you know another name for this? Because I've always looked at the tooltip and kind of named it based on that.
Same. Yeah, I don't know
Okay.
if there's some official name for that. And I joke about that stuff all the time. A lot of the names, same. I know we probably have one specific to it, but yeah. I go to the tooltip. I'm like, okay, that'll work.
Yeah. So if I toggle this button, you'll notice as I'm toggling the button, the blue buttons underneath are changing. The reason for that is the blue buttons, again, are asking, what am I cutting in? Now, I'm going to use a kind of a unique function to Premiere. I'm going to actually put both timelines on the screen at the same time. And this is where we get into something that one of our trainers in Hollywood kind of pioneered. He came up with a term for this. I guess he was hungry one day when he was editing and saw the timeline stacked on top of each other and called it pancake timeline.
Yes. I was going to say, it's one of the few terms that I leverage, and I always credit Vashi Nedomansky.
Absolutely.
He's the one. That's right. VashiVisuals.com. He's amazing. And yeah, he coined that phrase some time ago.
So the idea here is I now have both timelines visible on the screen. I'm actually doing something that you can't do in Media Composer, which is display both of these at the same time. Media Composer, it's more of a toggle. Here, I can actually see them both at the same time, and I can manipulate both together. There's a third option in here, which is a gang source and program option. What this will do is it will actually rock both monitors back simultaneously, so that things like when you JK and L, it'll start both of them playing back at the same time, which can be useful in certain areas where you're trying to synchronize something. But here, what I want to do, I cut in that nest. Now what I want to do is change this from cutting in a nest so that it's cutting in the individual clips. My timeline has 3 audio tracks and 3 video tracks. So when I look inside of my edit sequence, the one at the bottom, if I, let me just close all these tracks down here. Oops, there we go. And we'll kind of shrink those down. You'll notice by default, all 6 of these buttons are turned on. If I just want to cut in the video, we turn off all the audio. We turn off the video that we don't want to cut in. Now we're just cutting in V1. So now when I use that overwrite command, I'm going to use the period on my keyboard here. It just cuts in the range of clips from this in point here to this out point here get cut into my timeline. So again, it's about precision, and it's another way that you can use like string outs as you're putting footage together and you just kind of throw things onto different timelines. Think about the idea of loading them in the source monitor and how convenient that can be. Now, if you are a drag and drop person, this is something, it is also a strength of Premiere. Again, flexibility is key for all of this. If I wanted to, if there was just a single clip on the timeline, like this clip that I wanted to add, the beauty of pancake editing is I can actually just drag from one timeline to another. And that's something you'd never think about in a traditional source record format. But again, it's the flexibility. Use what you know, use what's best. And that is something that I always stress, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this segment.
Totally awesome, dude. Well, I'll tell you what, we're coming up on 45 minutes here. So any final thoughts on some things? And you know what I was going to ask you too, if you've got, what is your main social network? So if people want to contact you directly, they can do that.
I'm probably still easily available on Twitter. I'm not as vocal on Twitter, but it's at Karl Soule. So just take an @ sign and drop the little accent on my name. So it's just, KarlSoule, like it shows on the screen right now. That's an easy place to get a hold of me. I'm also available on Facebook under, I think my middle name is in my profile there. So it's Karl Lee, Lee Soule. Those are probably the places I'm most active. I'm less active on Instagram, but I do have a profile there as well.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Well, again, thank you, Karl, so much for joining. We'll be back, of course, next Thursday here on the stream, where Karl will once again talk about some super cool Hollywood workflows. In the meantime, if you've got stuff that you want to see on the stream, feel free to hit me up at Beetlejace, Karl just mentioned, at Karl Soule on Twitter. You can also comment on the videos, whether it's on Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, YouTube, or Behance. I compile all that stuff, and that's largely how we get a lot of the topics that we show. So until next week, thank you so much for joining us. Again, you'll be able to watch the replays on all the various social networks. And until then, have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you again next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.